here to introduce Dr. Karen Alexander. Karen is an associate professor with Heriot-Watt, based at the Orkney campus until very recently, currently based at Edinburgh, but with really strong links here to Orkney and visiting quite frequently, including today. Karen is a social scientist of the transition to blue economy, which is word she told me, specializing especially in environmental stewardship and conflict around oceans and coasts, with particular focus on marine governance and looking, among other areas, at offshore renewable energy. But she, leading a fairly large consortium, has recently won a large grant which will fund this new project that she's going to tell us about this evening. So it's better for her to tell you about that than me. Karen.
Thank you very much, Simon. We'll soon find out if I'm better to tell you about this project than you. That's not absolutely certain. But yes, as Simon mentioned, I am an associate professor with Heriot-Watt University, and I'm actually, although I'm based in Edinburgh, I am actually still very much a member of ICIT and a member of the Orkney campus, hence why they can't get rid of me. I keep appearing every few weeks. And it is, as always, an absolute delight to be here. And until recently, I was actually quite heavily involved with OREF as well. So I kind of feel like I'm doing my duty by giving a talk back, having left the board earlier this year. So yeah, what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to give a bit of an overview about this new project we've got called Transects, which stands for Transitions in Energy for Coastal Communities over Time and Space. It is a very new project, so I don't have a whole pile of interesting research to tell you about at this point. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're actually going to be doing in the project, to give you a bit of an idea about what we're going to be coming to Orkney and sort of asking the community about and engaging with the community about over the next 4 years. So, if you don't mind me indulging myself a little, I just want to give a little bit of a background about me because it might help you to understand a little bit more where I'm coming from when I talk about this project. So in terms of my educational background, I suppose, I'm a bit of a weird one. I started off wanting to be a politician many, many years ago, and then I stood for election and realised I really didn't want to be a politician at all. But I did study politics and sociology in a bid to do that. I then realised that the environment was very important, as I'm sure everybody here believes. And so I went to study a master's in environmental governance. And then that led me into a PhD in marine science. So you can see I've kind of gone from the very, very, very social science side of things and slowly but surely edged my way into the natural science side of things. But what that means is I tend to think of myself as an interdisciplinarian. So I'm very strong in the social science, but I also understand ecology and little bits of other things as well. And what that means is a lot of the research I do, I'm really keen in looking at how we can actually bring all of the disciplines together to answer some of the big challenges that we're actually facing in the world today, and particularly in the marine environment, which is where I tend to work. And then just another bit of information, this probably doesn't inform things quite as much, but I grew up on the west coast of Scotland. I did a lot of my studies there. I actually did my PhD at the Scottish Association for Marine Science, for those of you who know that in Oban. And then I went to Australia because I was desperate to get pretty much as far away from there as I could at the time. So I went to Australia and I spent 6 years there, and then came from Australia back to Orkney, where I spent the last 2.5 years until heading down to Edinburgh. So that's a little bit about me, and hopefully it gives a bit of background about me. What I do also want to show you is the Transects team. So as Simon mentioned, I am leading quite a large group of cats in this project. So we actually have 5 different universities involved in the project. It's being led by Heriot-Watt out of the Orkney campus, and you can see Sandy there. I'm sure several of you recognise him. He's involved, and I'm hoping that he'll rescue me if I forget what I'm talking about. But we also have colleagues from UHI Orkney as well. We have colleagues from the University of Aberdeen, from the University of Hull, the University of Strathclyde, and a colleague, Daryl Burden, who is a subcontractor in the project, who is a consultant. So quite a broad range of people involved in Transects, and also a very broad range of disciplines. So I myself have given you a little bit of background about me, but we also have ecologists, economists, archaeologists, artists, engineers, lawyers, geographers, and historians. I think that's all of the different disciplines that are involved in the project. So as I mentioned, herding a big group of cats is very difficult, bringing all of those disciplines together in a way that everybody actually understands what everybody else is talking about. So that makes our project meetings quite fun. Certainly a bit of a challenge, but they're an absolutely fantastic bunch of people, and potentially in Orkney, there's a lot of them you'll know the UHI Orkney people and the Heriot Watt people, but we're also going to have our colleagues from the other universities coming up to Orkney, and I'll explain why that is in a few minutes. So just to give a bit of background to this project and to give you an idea about what it's all about. Please excuse me, my brain doesn't work quite as well as it used to in terms of memory, so I do need to have notes with me occasionally. So basically, we know that many UK coastal regions have kind of flourished and then suffered from the growth of a variety of different industries, but particularly growth and decline of marine energy industries. And this generates a huge amount of environmental and social cultural change for the coastal communities in which these industries are based. So in particular, the exhaustion of natural capital resources, or as we're starting to see around some industries, do present challenges to community sustainability. And by sustainability, I mean the balance between economic growth, social well-being, and environmental care. And then also those communities' resilience. So by resilience, I mean adapting to change, adversity, and also being able to take advantage of new opportunities. So these flourishing and then declining marine energy industries can have quite huge impact. But yet, weirdly, despite us knowing that there are these boom and bust sort of cycles, we tend to focus on the economic aspects of these boom and bust cycles. We don't tend to think about the impact on the environmental aspects or on the environment in which we rely on for these industries. And we also don't tend to think about the social cultural components either. Nor do we consider whether these these energies, these changes in energy cycles, whether they're just. So a lot of you may have heard of the concept of a just transition as it relates to energy. It's become very much a buzzword like sustainability. So we're tending to hear about it quite a lot more in energy. And we don't really understand this just transition piece as it relates to energy. So there's quite a lot of gaps in our knowledge about what these boom and bust cycles mean for coastal communities. So with the transition to marine renewable energies that we're going through at the moment, this project is particularly interested in whether we can learn from historical energy transitions, a way that can inform our move to renewable energies in a way that helps coastal communities to develop strategies to increase their resilience. So we'll be looking at 3 industries. We'll be looking at the UK's transition through whale oil for the use of lighting as one of the original marine energy transitions that we saw. We'll then be looking at the transition through North Sea oil and gas, which of course is still ongoing at the moment. So we've still got quite a lot more we can learn. And we'll be looking at what lessons we can take from those 2 transitions and apply to the move to offshore renewable energy. So that's kind of the purpose behind this project. And what I want to do now is just quickly talk about these 3 eras. So the Industrial Revolution was partly fueled by whale oil, both in terms of burning lamps to light houses, and also for machine lubrication. I didn't know that until I actually started researching that for this talk. And it was also fueled by coal. But for us, we're looking at marine energies specifically. So although we recognise that coal has been a huge part of our energy supply for quite a long time, we'll only be touching upon it in this project. By the mid-1800s, the homes of the wealthy upper classes were generally lit by smokeless and odourless candles made from high-quality oil from sperm whales. And it was actually a really important energy source. In fact, it was the dominant source of light for quite a long time around the world. Old commercial whaling was based on sailing ships like these, rowing boats and hand-thrown harpoons. And the family of right whales, called so because they were slow-moving, they typically floated when they were killed, and so they were the right whales to catch. They were the main target. Radical innovations in the 1860s led to the emergence of the modern whaling industry, which included a switch to coal-fired steamships. So I mentioned that reliance on coal, and the harpoon cannon. And these started to occur at a time when actually the discovery of petroleum could start to offer a substitute for whale oil, which both increased the capacity to catch whales whilst also suppressing the need for whale oil in the first place. Whilst whaling actually continued well into the 20th century, the use of whale oil for lighting stopped pretty much in the late 1880s when Edison began building the public electric lighting systems that we've seen coming in the late 19th century. If we then move on to the oil and gas era, so we're talking about the 1960s onwards, at its peak actually in 1913, the UK produced 292 million tonnes of coal. So the peak of coal was actually quite early on in the 20th century. And that fueled the needs of home consumers, as well as having a substantial export trade as well. But after the Second World War, world oil production increased and it began to replace coal in the UK, particularly for transportation. At first, Britain's oil was mostly exported from the Middle East. And then in 1965, gas was discovered in the southern North Sea, and in 1969, oil was discovered in the central North Sea. The UK's first offshore oil was landed in 1975, and by 1980, the volume produced was actually equivalent to the UK's total consumption. By 1984, the UK was the world's 5th largest oil producer. I did not realise the UK was ever that large. While we continue to issue new oil and gas licenses, as I'm sure you're all aware, production from the North Sea has actually been in decline for quite some time. And the UK is now committed to net zero emissions by 2050. And over 200 oil and gas fields are actually due to be decommissioned over the next decade. So we're very much coming towards the end of that energy transition as we move into the current one. So renewable energy era, 1990s onwards. As we know, as I'm sure everybody here knows, the UK is a global leader in offshore renewable energy, and the new government is committed to quadrupling offshore wind by 2030. According to Renewable UK, there are currently 43 offshore wind farms around the British coast, comprising 2,652 wind turbines. The first commercial offshore wind farm was constructed in 2003 off the coast of North Wales. And then the world's first full-scale floating wind farm became operational in 2017 on the north coast of Scotland. Of course, I would absolutely be remiss not to mention the advances being made in relation to wave and tidal energy, but we are still, as we know, in the very early stages for these. So our focus in this project is going to be primarily around offshore wind. So we're going to be focusing on 3 different energy transition periods, but we're also going to be focusing on 3 different UK areas. So we're going to be focusing on the Humber estuary. We're going to be focusing on the east coast of Scotland, more specifically Aberdeenshire, and we're going to be focusing on the Orkney Islands. Each was and remains a key UK location that both hosted and shaped lucrative marine energy resources. So in the 1970s, over 200 ships and 10,000 men were sailing whaling boats annually to the Arctic from ports including Hull, Aberdeen, Dundee and Kirkwall, and this lasted very late into the 19th century. With the discovery of North Sea oil and gas in 1969, the first commercial gas licence was based off the Humber estuary. Locating the Piper oil field in 1973 led to the creation of the oil terminal on Flotta. And it was estimated that by 1985, 40% of Aberdeen's workforce relied upon oil. So all areas, oil and gas has been very important for as well. And then furthermore, between the offshore wind deepwater ports hub, the UK free ports and the ScotWind offshore wind leasing round, all three areas are also primary locations for future marine renewable energies as well. So all three locations have been through all three marine energy transitions, and that's why we're focusing on these areas. So what are we going to be doing? Well, there's quite a few different components to this project, which is very much related to the fact that we have so many different disciplines involved, but hopefully you'll get a feel for why we have all of these different focuses. So the first one is around natural capital stocks, flows and values. So the marine environment comprises stocks of natural capital, which can include habitats, species and processes, which then provide flows of ecosystem services, which then result in a range of societal benefits. So our project is taking what's called a natural capital approach to ensure that our dependence on natural resources for energy is considered when we actually look at the impacts of these marine energy transitions. So we'll be identifying natural capital stocks, flows and benefits associated with the three different transitions. We'll be looking at how they're interlinked, and we'll be looking at how they have affected coastal community resilience. And so this will include all sorts of data. It'll include environmental data, historical data, economic, social, and particularly spatial data. So just to give you an example of what I actually mean by natural capital, I just wanted to show you here some of the indicators that we're actually thinking of looking at in the project. So excuse me, it was actually quite easy to find indicators that are of relevance to whaling because it's a biotic resource. So we can talk about how many, we can talk about whale populations, we can talk about how many of them we've landed. We can look at how much energy was produced, how much went to other uses. We can look at jobs, we can look at the infrastructure that we developed around the whaling industry, and then we can look at the knock-on benefits on society, so things around health impacts, pollution, shipwrecks, loss of life, etc. And so that's actually a really important point because we do have the benefits and disbenefits aspects when we're thinking about natural capital. So it was relatively easy to kind of come up with some of these potential indicators for thinking about natural capital of whales. It becomes a lot more complicated to try and do this when we're talking about abiotic resources such as water and seabed and the sorts of things that we're actually using when we think about oil and gas and also offshore wind. So this is one of the things that we're going to be focusing around trying to understand and get a handle on in the project is what are the indicators that we can use to start to measure some of these aspects of natural capital so that we can then look at how they've changed over time. In addition to the sort of more scientific data, for want of a better word, that we're considering, excuse me, in the natural capital approach component of the project, we are also looking at bringing in emotions, memories, and identities that relate to how people have been impacted by these marine energy transitions. So we'll do what we're calling repeopling the past. What we mean by that is we're starting to use, or we will be using methods such as visual arts, contemporary archaeology, and heritage studies to start to document and interpret the cultural and historic aspects of these energy transitions. So these approaches will be used to visualize the impacts of transitions on communities and to start to create spaces for dialogue about future changes. We'll collect oral histories and personal stories, which can provide really valuable insights into how individuals and communities have actually been impacted by past energy transitions, as well as how they view future developments. We'll also be using community exhibitions and digital story mapping to collect this information and to engage directly with the public. And I will talk a little bit about these again later on. So just to give you an example of what we mean by some of the sort of stories that we're going to be collecting, a potential whaling related case study that my UHI colleagues are currently exploring here in Orkney relates to the Bursey whalebone, which some of you will have heard of. For those of you who are not aware, this was the remains of a right whale which was washed ashore in the 19th century. Unfortunately, it's not actually currently there because it was blown down and is sitting in someone's shed. In fact, the person whose shed it is currently in, their father was very connected to the Scottish whaling company Salveson's, which was a whaling transport and logistics company, and was involved in whaling in Antarctica in the early 60s. So this is very much within living memory. We think about whaling, we don't actually think, okay, there's very close connections to that particular period. So there are people in Orkney, for example, that still have this connection to whaling. One of the other things I mentioned earlier on as well was around this concept of a just transition. So we will be examining the impacts of marine energy transition on people and place with this emphasis on just and unjust transitions. And this concept actually refers to ensuring that the shifts towards sustainable energy systems are equitable, are inclusive, and don't this is a terrible word, disproportionately burden vulnerable communities. So we can't compare justice over time. We can't say, okay, whaling was more just and oil and gas was less just or anything like that. But what we can actually do is compare social and political change over these periods, and that gives us an idea of trends in a just transition. So often when people think about just transitions, they think about job creation. That tends to be quite a big focus of it, but it isn't the only aspect. So a just transition should also address broader social justice issues, such as equitable employment opportunities, but also the revitalisation of communities, high street decline, which is something that we're seeing quite a lot throughout Scotland, issues around childcare and living costs, etc. So just transition is really looking at this broader social environment in which we live and trying to get a handle on how these energy transitions have changed how we make decisions around these things. Excuse me. So just to continue in this vein of a just transition, my colleagues at the University of Aberdeen are actually already exploring this concept as it relates to oil and gas in Aberdeen specifically. As part of this work, they've developed a set of indicators through which to measure a just transition based around themes of employment, earnings and skills, housing, poverty and well-being, community empowerment, revitalisation and net zero, and democratic participation. And this democratic participation piece is also very important when we think about a just transition. Are people's voices being heard? Are they engaging in or being able to engage in the decisions that we're making? And so it's this framework that we plan to use for the Transects project. And such indicators can be used as proxies for evaluating progress, and they can also help to inform policy, support stakeholder dialogue, etc. So we're hoping to use some of this work that my colleagues at Aberdeen have done to start these discussions with the communities that we're working with around what a just transition might look like. And then last but not least, and this is the bit that Sandy will probably shout at me about because I'll probably get it all wrong, but we're also looking at bringing all of the empirical data together to assist communities to actually develop their own strategies to enable future marine energy transitions that do increase their resilience and do increase sustainability. So the idea is that we're hoping to help communities to define what they want to see as a marine energy transition, and to then strategize the necessary steps to achieve those changes. The key focus here is around empowerment and capacity building. So we don't want to come in and say, well, here's what the research shows and this is what we think you should do. We want to make sure that the communities that we're working with are actually working through that change themselves, and that we're supporting as much as is useful or not. One of the things that we're also considering here, we use the term theory of change, which people may or may not have heard of. But one of the things that we've talked about quite a lot as a group is the fact that we're not talking about theory here. We want to think about action. We want to think about what change actually looks like and how we can help to facilitate that. And this is a key point at which we really, well, it's one of many key points actually at which we're really hoping to engage and directly work with the coastal communities that are our case study locations. Out of this work, what we're hoping we'll be able to develop is a transitions blueprint toolkit, which actually contrasts and compares across the different case studies and looks at whether there's some lessons that we're seeing that are actually coming from all locations. So there's a couple of outputs that I want to talk about as well, because I think, or I hope certainly, that some of these will be of interest and also quite useful. We're going to be a typical sort of research project and have papers and all of these sorts of things that often come out of research projects. But one of the things that we're really keen to make sure with this project is that we're not just coming into a community, collecting all the information, disappearing off, and you never hear from us again. What we really want to make sure of is that all of our information that we collect, all of the research we do, is available to the communities that we operate within. So one of the key outputs we're looking at is something we're calling an energy transitions atlas. As you can see here, this is most definitely not an energy transitions atlas. It's about the impact of World War II on Japan's cities, but this will hopefully give you an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about an energy transition atlas. So it's very much a digital online interactive map, which allows us to put pinpoints on a map, places that are important for energy transitions, and to bring in that data and also the stories into one location so that you can look at a particular place in Orkney and see the data that links to that place around the energy transitions and hear or see the stories that are associated with that. We're also going to look at developing a mini exhibitions roadshow based on the scientific data, the stories, and the artworks that will be developed as part of the project. And we'll bring each of these to the case study locations. And what we'd really like is that actually from this, we do get feedback from the community about how useful or not this information is. Many of our project partners, who I'll talk about in a second, are museums and art galleries, including the Pier Arts Gallery here in Stromness. And we're really keen to work closely with them throughout the project. And I just put this picture of the bus because I thought it was really cool, and I love the idea of us actually having a project that we can tour around the UK. I think that would be awesome. So if anybody has a bus that they want to give us for this purpose, please let me know. So these are some of our stakeholder partners. We have quite a wide range of stakeholder partners, 12 partners who are also involved in the project. So I mentioned earlier on that we have 12 co-investigators in the project. I also have 12 stakeholder partners involved in the project. Getting all of these guys together is interesting. But they're all super, super engaged with the project and very interested in seeing what the outputs of it are. So we do have government stakeholder partners in form of Marine Management Organisation and Marine Scotland, but also agencies such as Nature Scot, Historic England and Orkney Islands Council. We have industry partners in the form of Offshore Energy UK, and then local groups like the Aberdeen Renewable Energy Group. And then we have a range of museums and art galleries that are also partners on the project as well. So again, a very wide range of people involved in the project. So what does Transects actually mean for you who are gathered here today? Hopefully I've kind of made it clear as we've gone through this talk that we are actually really keen to engage with all stakeholders. Don't be put off by the fact that the title refers to energy transitions. Obviously, this is an OREF talk. We're here because we're all interested in energy. But at the end of the day, we're keen to engage with everybody across Orcadian coastal community, or coastal communities. We really want to understand the effects that these transitions have on communities more broadly. We want to look for opportunities as well around data sharing. So we do need data for our project. So we're going to certainly be out there trying to find it and making use of archives and things like that are here in Orkney. But we also, as I mentioned, want to make sure that our data is available to the community as well for whatever use that may be. We want to hear your stories as they relate to the 3 eras that we're exploring, but we also want to make sure that your voice is heard. And that, as I said, we're not just collecting information and going away and you never hear from us again. We think it's really, really important that there is a lot of local knowledge in the area around these energy transitions. And we think it's really important that this is documented before we lose it, because we know what the impacts of losing a lot of institutional knowledge can be. And then we also want to hear what you think about the project. And hopefully the discussion that we have after this might actually start to give me an idea of what you think about this project. But we want to make sure that what we're doing is actually useful for the communities that we're working with. So we will be reaching out at various points throughout the project, both to make sure that you have a chance to engage if you want to and think it's useful, and also to take us to task. I think that's also really important. If you think what we're doing is a load of nonsense, feel free to tell me. We're still going to go ahead probably with the project in some form or another, but I certainly want to hear what you think about the project and to take us to task if you feel you need to. We want to make sure that what we're doing is something that's needed, is appropriate, and is in a format that is useful to the Orkney community. The main public-facing resource we're going to have is our project website, so you'll be able to follow what we're up to here. There'll be opportunities to engage or feedback to us through the website, but we'll also be looking at other ways and means as well. So, for example, having lived in Orkney for 2.5 years, I know that Radio Orkney and Facebook are probably 2 of the real key sort of communication areas that we should be using in the project. But again, if you have thoughts about how you want to communicate with our project, how you want to be engaged, etc., please do come and have a chat with me. So I think at this point, I've managed to speak for 35 minutes. That's amazing. I think at this point, I'll stop talking about the project. And what I really want to do is kind of pass over to both the people in the room and the people online to hear your thoughts about the project and to try and answer any questions that you might have. So thank you very much.
I think as well as being chair, I'm also being mic runner today, due to a little bit of equipment limitation. We have a question over there.
So, two focus areas of this project will be Orkney and Aberdeenshire, and we all know some would argue they are fishing dependent communities. Some would argue they are heavily fishing communities. That means the fishing is not only an important economic source, especially for some of the vulnerable groups and rural groups in there, as well as a very important cultural heritage. They are not only fishing for the money, but fishing for a sense of belonging. So I think the interesting point was that how the fishing communities is changing, with the energy transition and especially with the development of the wind, the offshore wind, uh, you know, farm and also the development of the marine protection areas. The fishers are worried about you know, the basically the closure of the marine areas, and also because fishers they have very strong social capitals, so which means they have their resilience, but which also means they are not tended to interact that much with marine spatial planning and
Summarize one.
I see. So just to focus on whether this project will have focus on the how fishing communities change with in line with the energy transitions, because both Aberdeenshire and Orkney is the fishing communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a really important point, Mung. Thank you for raising that. So yes, absolutely. We will be working with fishing communities as well as part of that. I know, for example, when I did my PhD, which is quite a few years ago now, on the west coast of Scotland, I was looking at the impacts of renewable energy on the fishing industry. So it's an area I'm particularly interested in. And what we did find was that fishers themselves at the time did think that there would be changes to their industry caused by renewable energy, not just because of the spatial squeeze that it causes, but because it offers opportunities for different types of employment, whether that is as providing services to the offshore wind farms themselves because they have the maritime skills, etc., that's needed. So yes, absolutely. There's a very strong link there with fishermen and understanding how those communities will change over time. And that's all part of that energy transition process. And it's not just fishermen. There are many other uses of the marine environment that we'll also be considering, because tourism is going to change as we see more people actually going and visiting wind farms, for example, as part of tourism processes. So there's going to be lots of different activities that are going to change, and we will be looking at those across the project.
Let's go to other people first. Martin.
Yeah, just going back to whaling, I'm not quite clear, are you looking at the product of whaling, i.e. lamp oil, or the impact of people working in the whaling industry? The reason I'm asking that question is I did a little bit of research about oil refining and how it developed. And the thing I was reading suggested that by the early 1900s that artificially produced lamp oil from petroleum products was way undercutting the price of oil from whales. And basically they had to keep on whaling, they had to find other uses for the product.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you're completely correct. And again, it's a really good point. So yes, we will be looking at whaling from the perspective of lamp oil and the period during which it was used for that purpose. But yes, absolutely, it did change with coal and with petroleum. The uses of whale resource was different. So we're only going to be looking at it during the period that it was actually used for whale oil and for lamp oil, and understanding that the changes that it had during that period, but with still reflecting that the fact that whaling went on until, this century. So it has gone on for a long time. It's just not been used for the purpose we're particularly interested in.
Yeah, I remember my dad said that they've never seen whale meat for sale before or after the war, but during the war it was available.
Oh, really?
But they only ever bought it once because they didn't like it.
See, that's exactly the sorts of stories we want to be able to collect in Transects, because that is a really, really interesting part of the whole story, is the piece around the use of whales for other resources as well. It might not be the focus of what we're looking at in the project, but we still need to understand all of these pieces because they're all part of a much bigger puzzle. So yeah, I'd love to talk to you about that further.
Let's go to Sandy next.
So you asked me a
Bit
question. You're part of the
unfair because I'm not
project.
part of the project, but I got a question anyway, Karen. I think you made a good point, or is it we made a good point? I don't know. You made a good point about coastal communities and this sort of boom bust thing, and you can look around the UK at coastal communities. You've got some of the wealthiest communities in the UK and some of the absolutely the poorest. This project's about energy transitions and the huge change that they've brought, and you think about oil and it's coming to an end and the potential huge change. So I suppose my question is, to what extent do you think communities have got any agency over this? Because part of our aspiration is that to help people design the kind of change transition that they want. But to what extent do you think people actually have agency, or do you think the forces that create these changes are just beyond our control and, the industry just sweeps in and then disappears?
I think it's a great question. And I think my sense is that communities have agency, but not over whether the transition happens. So I think these transitions are going to happen whether we like it or not. Offshore, we know offshore wind is coming to Orkney, whether we like it or not, is happening. So the question then is, what can we have agency over? And I mean, I've always been particularly interested. I said right at the beginning, I wanted to be a politician. I've always been particularly interested in civic participation and looking at how people can actually have agency over what happens to them and the societal level decisions that are made. But I think that's what I'd really like to see Transects start to parse out, is what do we have agency over? What can we actually influence and not influence? And that's what I'm hoping, particularly around the just transition piece, that will start to become clearer, and we'll start to get a sense of how can we get involved in these transitions? Where can we make change? What do we want to do? What do we want it to look like? So I don't think we have any agency over deciding whether the transitions happen or not. But I think there are aspects within that where we can make sure that they are fairer, that they're more just, that they can help us to develop to be the communities we want to be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So those online, please do feel free to put your hands up. I am keeping an eye. But in the meantime, I think, Lara, you had a question?
Thank you. Thanks, Simon. Thanks so much, Karen. It's a really interesting project, and what I'm seeing is a very kind of clear-cut, apparent separation between nature and society, right? In the natural capital approach between the flows and the stocks and the social benefits and disbenefits. And I'm just wondering, when we're thinking about this just transition piece, and a lot of this is often framed in response to the planetary crisis and everything else, what your thoughts are, or whether there's space in the project to consider more kind of socio-energy or ecological and social connections and different relationships between this natural capital, quote unquote, and the coastal communities that relate to it and depend on it, but also co-construct that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for raising that, Lara, because it is a really good point. So yes, we've kind of split the project out in the way we have because we have to some extent, to be able to explain to the funder what it is that we're doing in some sort of way that makes sense. But I think we fully recognise as a project team that it isn't that clear cut. And one of the things we're particularly interested in is in the natural capital approach, what are the linkages between the socio-cultural, the economic, the environmental, and recognising that they're not entirely different things. So there's the recognising within those things that there are interconnections, and we need to understand those. But then that's where we're trying to bring in the just transition and the repeopling piece as well, to recognise that we don't just understand the environment that we operate in the form of scientific data, for example, and numbers, but we understand it in terms of our memories, our stories, how it affects us, how it makes us feel. So I think that's what we're trying to start to recognise, those real interconnections in the project. And one of the really important things for us is we're employing 3 postdocs on the project, and they will be working very closely together. One of them's working on just transitions, one of them's working on the natural capital environmental side, and one of them's working on the natural capital social and economic side. And what we're really keen to see is that actually they are working very closely together the whole way through, because we do want those interconnections and those relationships to really come through the project. We don't want it to just be somebody going off and doing that part, somebody going off and doing that part, etc. Because that's not how we understand the world.
I ask a quick question myself.
Sure.
This might be very naive, and it might be that you didn't mention because it's so obvious. But it's about impacts. You've talked about outputs for the communities, and you've talked about outputs that consist of recorded data, which sound really valuable. Is there also a hope that you'll be in a position after this project to advise policymakers on how to handle this better, how to handle the transitions better?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm hoping that the fact that we've got stakeholder partners who are government organisations, that means that they are going to be interested in the outputs of the research for their own purposes of decision making. And I certainly get that sense from our stakeholder partners that that is where their interest lies. Yes, we will be. One of the things that I mentioned the Energy Transitions Atlas is one of the outputs that we have. But we're also going to have policy briefings, et cetera, things like that are coming out of the project, which we would think of as much more standard, perhaps, research outputs. But yeah, the idea is absolutely to bring them along on the journey and to make sure that our findings and outputs and the information we give them is what they need as well. And that's why we've got such a strong stakeholder partner engagement with the project.
Fantastic, thank you. Mong, I think we're back to you.
So this is a two-fold question. First, you mentioned that some of the data will be from archive, but I understand there will be a lot of archive. So will the computer version, or aka artificial intelligence, actually it's computer vision technologies, be used to extract data from those archives? And the second question is that you mentioned about the geospatial data visualization, and also I noticed this project has a strong citizen sense. So I was wondering if you will apply crowdsourcing into this project. So for people who don't understand what is crowdsourcing, I give us a very simple example. So researchers, they will want to understand how is the the degradation of the ring of Buddha. So they ask people to share the images, family images taken in front of the ring of Buddha to upload it online for last 60 years. And they, because with the image, you can have attribute of when it is taken. So they analyzed the images, people uploaded where the family taken in front of the ring of Buddha in the last 60 years to using computer vision technologies to understand the degradation of ring of Buddha in the last 60 years. So this is an example of a crowdsourcing project. Thank you.
So to summarize, question one about use of AI to synthesize from archives, and
Uh,
question
yes.
about use of
One sourcing, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I will be honest and say that we do not have AI involved in the project at the moment. It's not something that we've considered as one of our methods. I guess part of the reason for that being because I think from both the crowdsourcing perspective and the AI perspective, we'd be looking at collecting vast volumes of data then. That would be the purpose of using those in the first instance. Whereas we're in this project, I think we're quite interested at doing a deep dive around particular stories. So, for example, in the repeopling piece, I gave the example of the Bursey whalebone. We're actually really interested in digging really deep into these singular stories rather than trying to get that broad spread across a bigger area. So we haven't really talked about the two methods that you've mentioned at all for that reason, because we're not trying to collect large amounts of data that we can then make general inferences around, but really dig into specific instances and gather what we can about individual stories. So I don't know if that answers your question, sorry, but yeah, we haven't really looked at that at all.
Thank you. We have a question online. David.
Hello. Sorry, I haven't worked out how to use my videos, so apologies for that. I was just wondering if we talked about, I guess, one of the important things for communities these days is whether they can get agency over things. And I was wondering if you'd come across any historical examples where that was achieved, or are you looking for those? And do you think that would be a useful thing to learn from?
Yeah, thanks, David. Yes, I do, 100%. I mean, I haven't come across examples. Certainly, we're still quite early stages in the project. I haven't come across any examples of communities having agency in industrial change, I guess, to the extent that I'd like to see happen around these energy transitions, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. It just means I don't know. And Sandy's waving his hand, so here he does know, obviously. So I'll pass to him.
Sorry, Karen. I think one good example of that actually is in Orkney and Shetland. And when the I'm not trying to go into detail too much, but we had some very charismatic leaders in the 1970s, particularly Ian Clark, leader of the Shetland County Council, and Joe Grimmond, MP at the time, which led to legislation which allowed the islands to gain some control over what happened when oil and gas came in terms of where it went, and importantly, get a revenue from it as well. So rather than just getting beads to the natives, or I shouldn't have said that, sorry, but football strips for the football teams, that level of thing, you actually got a sort of chunk of the rent, as to talk in economic terms. So I think there's something to be learned from. It's not necessarily exactly the same situation that we find ourselves in now. But yeah, I think there are examples out there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And apologies, I should have thought of that example myself because it is one I'm aware of. But it is a good point, and it is a great example of where there has been community agency. And yes, I think there's a question around whether something like that would fly nowadays to that level, but who knows? And maybe that's the sort of conversations that we want to be having in the project, is starting to discuss, could we look at doing something like that again?
Well, as a data point, I was going to suggest you might look at the number of ships in each harbour, which you could get from photographs, as has been suggested. The reason I thought of that is my father worked for the Marine Lab in Aberdeen, He started in about 1950. And he said at that point, the Marine Lab was one distant hut, and Aberdeen Harbour was full of fishing boats. And when he retired in 1980, the Marine Lab had grown to 3 office blocks and hundreds of people working there. And there were no fishing boats in the harbour at all. So it's a sort of interesting aspect of agency. You would think you might control things, but you can't.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. That's an interesting change to try and further understand what led to the differences between the quantities of each thing. And I think that's the thing. It kind of goes back to what Lara said earlier on. It's really easy to be black and white, I think, with any research project and to say we're going to go and collect data on this and it's going to tell us this. But in reality, it's never that simple. And I think there's going to be a huge amount of work for us in this project in actually trying to parse out some of those interconnections and understand what the relationships are between different pieces of change that all are part of that bigger puzzle.
Sadly, the Marine Lab is shrinking again, and I'm not seeing any resurgence of fishing boats in Aberdeen. But we might hope. Any final questions from anybody? Yes, fabulous. Sorry, folks.
Hi. I was just wondering what your motivation was when you were talking about integrating the arts into your project.
What my motivation was for
what was
bringing
your
arts in full stop. That's a great question. So when I was working in Tasmania, I did quite a lot of work with artists of different types. So for example, I was involved in an aquaculture project where we brought in composers and developed a piece of music around changes to the aquaculture sector was creating. And what we've found is that as humans, we understand scientific data, right? But we also understand a whole pile of other things. And quite often when we have scientific data on its own, it's not necessarily easy to make a connection to what we actually understand around that thing. It's a lot of the time just numbers that tells us something and tells us something really important, but it doesn't have that emotional connection to what's going on. Whereas what we find is that by bringing the arts in, that can actually lead to that stronger emotional connection. And when we're talking about wanting to make change, change doesn't often happen when you just present someone with numbers. But if you can actually make that emotional connection as to what that change is going to mean and what those numbers mean in a sense that people feel, that's when you tend to get change starting to happen. So that's my motivation around bringing them in. Also, they're just really cool people and fun to work with.
Yeah, I've just been thinking about the tradability of the energy outputs. So whale oil would be tradable across the whole world with restrictions due to tariffs and wars and things like that. But basically, it's a freely tradable resource. The same pretty much goes for oil. Gas was more restricted because of the pipelines that it was connected to. So at one point in time, if there was excess gas, they couldn't get rid of it. They had to flare it off. And then as now you're looking to renewable energy in terms of electricity, we have a limited amount of export capacity available. And I did some like a fag packet in Excel actually, but if you're going to build 4 times the offshore wind that the government is proposing by 2030, you're going to have about 30 gigawatts of extra interconnector capacity to get rid of it, to be able to make it a freely tradable. And I don't think that's going to happen. So therefore, there's going to be a considerable price swing depending on what's happening. And that's going to lead to other potential industries, which we haven't really been thinking about at the moment. And I'm not sure that those other industries really were relevant to your earlier energy transitions.
Yeah.
But with renewable energy, offshore wind, we have to think about that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's actually about 5 things that I'd like to pick up on in what you've just said, but I'm probably not going to remember all of them. I mean, I think the first point actually in itself, the very first point you made about the tradability is a really interesting one, because we're dealing with very different industries in that respect, and it isn't something we've talked about hugely within the project yet, is around that sort of supply and demand piece that relates to having exports, etc. So I think that in itself is a really interesting point that really affects the changes that these industries have on coastal communities. I think this is where my brain is really going to stop working. I think your point around us not being able to get rid of the resource as well and ending up having to find ways to do things differently is a really, really important point. I mean, I experienced the situation in terms of not being able, when I was living here in Orkney, I wasn't allowed to install solar panels in my house because there's already too much energy going to the grid, or I couldn't install solar panels in a way that allowed me to export to the grid. So I'm well aware of some of those issues, and they're going to be very different in Orkney than they are, for example, in Aberdeenshire and Hull. So I think thinking about those infrastructural issues with offshore wind is going to be very different across the different case studies, and again is going to have a hugely different impact on the coastal communities having to operate within the confines of the supporting infrastructure. And I've probably not made comment on a bunch of other points that you made there as well, but it's a really important point, and we there are some of the discussions we haven't started to have in the project yet, but I think we need to. So thank you.
Final question, I think, from Mark.
It's more a comment and maybe a reflection of my naivety to this whole thing. But because you mentioned about getting rid of the excess energy, what about these plans for diverting energy from Scotland down to England? How does that fit into your project in terms of a just transition?
I think that's probably not something I want to comment on at this point in time, would be my answer to that. But the whole point of exporting and diverting energy, it's going to be an issue for offshore wind. So we are going to have to consider it as part of the project, as you said, particularly around that just transition piece. It's going to have implications. Just in the same way that oil and gas, I mean, Sandy mentioned earlier on, you know, the sort of justice implications of the fact that Aberdeenshire became a very, very wealthy area because of oil and gas, and to some extent Shetland as well, for example. So, you know, we have seen huge changes for specific communities that then other communities haven't experienced as part of that transition. So we're going to see the same for offshore wind as well. So again, I think these are all things that we're going to have to really consider throughout the project.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Karen, for an interesting talk. Thank you very much, everyone else, for coming along and for asking some wonderful questions. Also, those who are for joining from home and asking wonderful questions. Much appreciated. It's been an interesting conversation. I have no particular announcements because I'm not Neil Kermode, except that the next OREF meeting is the 12th of November. It will be here, and you'll be hearing from me. I haven't figured out what the title is yet, but it'll be about the physics of tidal energy and the implications that has for policy, which might be of interest to some. It will be available online if those who are visiting from Edinburgh want to join us. Otherwise, thank you everyone, and have a nice evening. And please, another round of applause for Karen.
Thank you.